Ever wonder why your relationships hit the same wall, even with different people? What if the sabotage isn't from external forces, but from a hidden blueprint within you? We're diving into the dark side of attachment, exploring how your past, according to Freud, is secretly undermining your present love life. In 1914, Sigmund Freud noticed something disturbing in his Vienna practice. His patients weren't just talking about their pain. They were actively recreating it. A woman who grew up with an emotionally distant father would inevitably marry emotionally distant men, then spend years trying to extract the warmth they could never give. A man abandoned by his mother at age 7 would choose partners who eventually left him, fulfilling a prophecy written in childhood. Over and over, intelligent, self-aware individuals return to the same painful experiences like moths to a flame. Freud called this phenomenon repetition compulsion, and it contradicted everything psychology understood at the time. The prevailing belief was elegantly simple. Humans seek pleasure and avoid pain. The pleasure principle governed all behavior. Yet here were his patients, deliberately walking into situations that caused them profound suffering. They weren't masochists seeking pain for its own sake. They weren't stupid or lacking insight. They were trapped in an unconscious pattern that felt more powerful than logic, more compelling than self-preservation. The breakthrough came when Freud realized these patterns originated in unresolved childhood experiences. His patients weren't consciously choosing pain. Their unconscious minds were attempting to master old traumas by recreating them in new relationships. It was psychological alchemy, the hope that by repeating the painful experience, they could finally transform it. This time, the distant father would show love. This time, the abandoning mother would stay. This time, the ending would be different. But the unconscious doesn't understand that repetition rarely brings resolution. It only knows the compulsion to try again. In his groundbreaking work, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud argued that humans possess a drive that supersedes even the desire for happiness. We're compelled to repeat, to return, to recreate. The familiarity of pain becomes strangely comforting compared to the terrifying uncertainty of genuine joy. If this sounds familiar, you're experiencing something Freud first identified over a century ago. Your relationship sabotage isn't random chaos or a character flaw. It's a precisely orchestrated unconscious strategy, refined over years, designed to keep you in familiar emotional territory. Modern neuroscience has validated Freud's observations in stunning detail. Brain imaging studies reveal that familiar experiences, even painful ones, activate reward centers in the brain more powerfully than novel positive experiences. The neural pathways formed in childhood become highways of least resistance, carved deeper with each repetition. Your brain literally finds it easier to process familiar pain than unfamiliar happiness. The unconscious doesn't evaluate whether an experience is healthy or destructive. It only recognizes familiar versus unfamiliar. And familiar always wins the battle for your behavior. This neurological reality explains why relationship sabotage feels so automatic, so utterly beyond your conscious control. You're not weak-willed. You're not fundamentally broken or self-destructive. You're operating under the influence of neural patterns established decades ago, when you were too young to choose them consciously. Anyone who's pushed away someone who genuinely loved them knows this terrible feeling. The moment when everything is finally perfect, when you should be happiest. And suddenly, you're overwhelmed with an inexplicable urge to destroy it all. That urge isn't random. It's not proof that you're incapable of love. It's your unconscious mind trying desperately to return you to familiar territory, where it knows the rules, where it knows how to survive. But why would your brain choose familiar pain over unfamiliar happiness? The answer lies in your earliest memories, in the attachment blueprint established before you could even speak. She was 6 years old when she learned that love meant waiting. Her father came home late every night, too tired to notice her drawings taped to the refrigerator, too distracted to hear about her day at school. She would sit by the window, watching for his car, practicing what she would say to make him smile. But by the time he arrived, the moment had passed. She learned to make herself small, undemanding, invisible. She learned that love was something you earned through perfect behavior, and even then, it might not come. 40 years later, she finds herself in the same position, waiting for a partner who's always too busy, too tired, too distant. Her friends tell her she deserves better. She knows they're right. But there's something about this dynamic that feels like home. The waiting, the hoping, the perpetual disappointment. It's all achingly familiar. This is what Freud understood. Our earliest relationships create a template, a blueprint for every intimate connection that follows. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth decades after Freud's initial observations, provided the empirical framework for what Freud intuitively grasped. The bond formed with our primary caregivers in the first 3 years of life becomes the lens through which we perceive all future relationships. If that bond was secure, if our needs were consistently met with warmth and reliability, we develop a fundamental trust in intimacy. We believe, at a cellular level, that love is safe, that people can be counted on, that our needs matter. But if that early bond was inconsistent, dismissive, or frightening, we develop what psychologists call insecure attachment patterns. The child whose needs were ignored learns that closeness brings disappointment. The child whose parent was unpredictably available learns that intimacy is dangerously unreliable. The child who had to comfort their own parent learns that love means suppressing your own needs. These aren't conscious decisions. They're survival adaptations, formed in a developing brain that lacks the capacity for abstract reasoning. Freud recognized that these early experiences create what he called unconscious fantasies, deeply embedded beliefs about the nature of love and relationships. A child whose mother was depressed might unconsciously conclude, "My needs are too much. I exhaust people I love." A child whose father was critical might decide, "I'm fundamentally flawed. Love is conditional on perfection." These conclusions feel like absolute truths because they were formed before we had language to question them. They become the operating system running beneath our conscious thoughts. The tragedy is that these childhood decisions follow us into adulthood with ruthless consistency. The woman who learned that love means waiting will unconsciously select partners who make her wait. The man who concluded he's too much will push away partners before they can abandon him. We're not consciously seeking to recreate childhood pain. We're unconsciously seeking what feels familiar, what our neural pathways recognize as love, even when it hurts. This moment, this early blueprint formation, shapes everything that comes after. Modern neuroscience reveals why these patterns are so persistent. The amygdala, responsible for emotional memory, is fully developed in early childhood. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thought and impulse control, doesn't fully mature until our mid-20s. This means our deepest emotional patterns are established before we have the cognitive capacity to evaluate them. They bypass rational thought entirely, operating at a level that feels like pure instinct. If you've ever pushed away someone who loved you, wondering why you couldn't just let yourself be happy, this is why. You're not broken. You're protecting a wounded child who learned that happiness doesn't last, that love always comes with conditions, that closeness inevitably leads to pain. Sabotage wears many masks, and Freud spent decades identifying the tactics your unconscious uses to destroy what you consciously desire. These aren't deliberate acts of self-destruction. They're defense mechanisms, sophisticated psychological strategies that once protected you, but now imprison you. Understanding these four patterns is like learning to see the invisible architecture of your own mind. Once you recognize them, you can't unsee them. The first mask is projection. This is perhaps the most insidious form of sabotage because it feels completely real. Projection occurs when you attribute your own unacceptable feelings, fears, or impulses to your partner. A man terrified of abandonment becomes convinced his partner is about to leave, despite no evidence. A woman afraid of her own desire for independence accuses her partner of being emotionally distant. The unconscious takes the fear living inside you and places it outside onto the other person. It's a masterful trick. By making the threat external, you don't have to confront what's happening internally. Consider James, who grew up with a mother who left when he was 8. As an adult, he enters a healthy relationship with someone reliable and loving. But his unconscious cannot accept this reality. It conflicts too sharply with his internal blueprint that says, people leave. So he begins interpreting innocent behaviors as signs of impending abandonment. She takes a work trip. Clearly, she's pulling away. She needs alone time. Obviously, she's having second thoughts. He projects his abandonment terror onto her until, exhausted by his constant accusations and anxiety, she actually leaves. His unconscious has successfully recreated the familiar outcome. If you've ever accused your partner of the very thing you feared most, you've experienced projection's terrible power. The second mask is reaction formation. This occurs when you transform an unacceptable feeling into its opposite. A woman who fears becoming too dependent on her partner becomes excessively critical and distant. A man, terrified of his own vulnerability, becomes controlling and demanding. The original feeling, I need you desperately, is too frightening to acknowledge. So the unconscious flips it. I don't need anyone. In fact, you need to prove yourself to me. The criticism, the emotional distance, the impossible standards, these aren't reflections of how you truly feel. They're armor against feelings that terrify you. Freud observed this pattern repeatedly in his practice. Patients who were most critical of their partner's dependence were often those most afraid of their own dependency needs. Those who appeared most indifferent to intimacy were frequently those who craved it most desperately. Reaction formation is the unconscious saying, if I feel the opposite of what I fear, maybe the fear will disappear. But it never does. It only grows stronger, hidden beneath increasingly rigid defenses. Anyone in a relationship has felt this impulse to criticize when vulnerability feels too dangerous. The third mask is displacement. This strategy redirects emotional energy from the real target to a safer substitute. You're angry at your partner for something significant, but confronting them directly feels too risky. So you pick a fight about dishes in the sink, or how they loaded the dishwasher, or some other trivial matter. The unconscious has calculated that expressing anger about small things is safer than risking the relationship by addressing what really matters. But this leaves the real issue forever unresolved, building resentment that eventually corrodes the relationship from within. The fourth and perhaps most devastating mask is the self-fulfilling prophecy. Your unconscious holds a belief, I'm unlovable, or everyone leaves, or I don't deserve happiness. These beliefs demand validation, so you unconsciously behave in ways that make them come true. You withdraw emotionally until your partner feels shut out. You create tests they cannot pass. You manufacture crises that justify your deepest fears. This isn't manipulation. Your unconscious genuinely believes it's protecting you by proving what it already knows to be true. Better to control when and how you're abandoned than to live in constant fear of the unexpected. But here's what Freud discovered that changes everything. These mechanisms aren't proof of your dysfunction. They're evidence of your psyche's brilliant, desperate attempts at self-protection. This realization opens the door to freedom. In 1920, Freud introduced his most controversial and misunderstood concept, Thanatos, the death drive. This wasn't about literal death wish or suicidal ideation. It was something far more subtle and psychologically profound. Freud observed that humans possess a fundamental drive toward dissolution, toward returning to a prior state of being, toward the elimination of tension and stimulation. He called it the drive toward inorganic existence, toward the peace of non-being. Critics called it nihilistic. Freud called it unavoidable. The death drive explains a paradox that confounds common sense. Why do we destroy the very things that bring us joy? Why does success trigger self-sabotage? Why does genuine love sometimes feel more terrifying than loneliness? The answer lies in this uncomfortable truth. Growth requires leaving behind what we know. Happiness demands we abandon familiar suffering. And the unconscious experiences this abandonment as a kind of death. The death of your old identity, your old patterns, your old ways of protecting yourself from a world that once hurt you. Think about what happens when you finally meet someone who treats you well, someone consistent, kind, genuinely interested in you. If your blueprint says love equals struggle, this person creates massive cognitive dissonance. Your unconscious doesn't recognize this experience as love. It registers it as danger, as unfamiliar territory where the old survival strategies don't apply. The death drive kicks in, not to destroy you, but to return you to the familiar state where you know how to operate, even if that state involves suffering. Consider Maria, who spent 35 years in relationships with emotionally unavailable men. She knew the dance intimately. The pursuit, the rejection, the hope, the disappointment. When she met David, who was present, communicative, and emotionally generous, she felt nothing. No spark, no chemistry. Her friends thought she was being picky. Her therapist recognized the death drive at work. David represented growth, change, the death of her old patterns. Her unconscious couldn't tolerate it. 6 months later, she was back with an ex who barely texted her back. The relief she felt was genuine. She had returned home to the familiar suffering her psyche recognized as love. This is the death drive's greatest paradox. It doesn't make you pursue literal death. It makes you pursue psychological stasis, the comfort of unchanging patterns, even when those patterns cause tremendous pain. Change feels like dying, because, in a sense, it is. The old you, with all its familiar defenses and strategies, must die for a new you to emerge. And the unconscious will fight this death with everything it has. If success terrifies you more than failure, you're feeling the death drive's pull. Freud believed this drive was biological, hardwired into our cells' memory of inorganic existence. Modern psychology views it more as a psychological resistance to change and growth. But the effect is the same. You reach a moment of genuine possibility, a loving partner, a career breakthrough, authentic happiness, and something inside you recoils. This isn't weakness. It's not evidence that you don't deserve good things. It's your psyche doing what it was trained to do, protect you by keeping you in familiar territory, even if that territory is painful. The death drive reveals why relationship sabotage intensifies precisely when things are going well. The better the relationship, the more it threatens your old identity, the louder the unconscious screams to return to familiar ground. This is the moment when everything becomes clear. You're not afraid of your partner leaving. You're afraid of who you'll have to become if they stay. You're afraid of the death of your defended, protected self. You're afraid of the vulnerability that genuine love requires. But Freud offered something radical alongside this dark observation. By understanding the death drive, by bringing it into consciousness, you strip it of its power. The unconscious pattern can only control you when it remains unconscious. The moment you see it clearly, name it accurately, understand its origins, that's the moment you begin to break free. So how do you break free from this unconscious pattern? The answer is both simple and profoundly difficult. Freud's most revolutionary idea wasn't about discovering the unconscious. It was his belief that by making the unconscious conscious, we could achieve genuine freedom. Where it was, their ego shall be, he wrote. Translation: where unconscious impulses once controlled you, conscious choice can prevail. This wasn't optimistic fantasy. It was based on decades of clinical observation. Patients who could see their patterns, understand their origins, and bring them into awareness began to change. Not overnight, not easily, but definitively. The path to freedom begins with a single difficult step: seeing what you've spent a lifetime avoiding. The first step is radical awareness. You must become a detective of your own behavior, watching for the moments when sabotage emerges. Notice when you pick a fight right after a moment of closeness. Observe when you withdraw emotionally after your partner shows vulnerability. Pay attention to the stories you tell yourself about why the relationship won't work. These aren't random thoughts. They're the unconscious blueprint making itself visible. Neuroscientists call this name it to tame it. The act of identifying and labeling an emotion or pattern reduces its power over you. The amygdala's alarm response literally decreases when the prefrontal cortex can articulate what's happening. But awareness alone isn't enough. The second step requires something harder: compassion. When you see your sabotage patterns clearly, the temptation is to judge yourself harshly. Why do I keep doing this? What's wrong with me? This self-criticism only reinforces the shame that fuels sabotage. Instead, Freud insisted on understanding these patterns with empathy. That 6-year-old who learned love meant waiting. She was doing her best to survive. That 8-year-old boy who learned to never need anyone, he was protecting himself from unbearable pain. These defense mechanisms once saved you. They deserve respect, even as you outgrow them. If you're ready to see your patterns clearly, approach them as you would a frightened child, with gentleness, not judgment. The third step is the most challenging: actively challenging the unconscious narrative. Your blueprint tells you a story. Love always ends in abandonment. Happiness doesn't last. I'm too much for anyone to handle. These stories feel like facts because they were formed before you could distinguish between belief and reality. But they're not facts. They're interpretations, created by a child who had limited information and unlimited fear. Ask yourself, is this old story still true? Or am I living inside a conclusion drawn decades ago? This questioning doesn't happen once. It must happen repeatedly, every time the old pattern tries to reassert control. When the urge to sabotage arises, and it will, pause. Create space between impulse and action. In that space, ask, is this my conscious choice? Or is this my unconscious trying to return me to familiar territory? The answer becomes clear with practice. Conscious choices align with your stated values and goals. Unconscious patterns feel compulsive, urgent, beyond your control. They come with familiar justifications. I'm just being realistic. I'm protecting myself. This is too good to be true. These are the death drive's whispers, trying to pull you back to psychological stasis. Anyone who's broken free from destructive patterns started by learning to recognize these moments. The fourth step requires courage, creating new experiences that contradict the old blueprint. If your pattern is to withdraw when intimacy increases, practice staying present when vulnerability arises. If your pattern is to choose unavailable partners, deliberately date someone who's emotionally present, even if they don't trigger the familiar spark of anxiety and longing. This feels wrong at first. Your nervous system will protest. The new experience doesn't match your internal template, so it registers as danger. But here's the neurological miracle Freud intuited long before brain imaging existed. Repeated new experiences literally rewire neural pathways. Each time you stay when you want to flee, each time you trust when fear says run, you're creating new connections, weakening old patterns. Freud believed this process, psychoanalysis, he called it, required years. Modern neuroscience suggests he was right about the timeline, but overly pessimistic about the possibility of change. The brain maintains plasticity throughout life. Old patterns can be overwritten, not erased completely, but rendered less dominant. The unconscious blueprint doesn't disappear, but its power to control your behavior diminishes with each conscious choice that contradicts it. This journey requires patience, persistence, and immense courage. You're not just changing behavior. You're transforming your fundamental understanding of what love means, what you deserve, who you are beyond your defenses. The final insight Freud offered is perhaps the most liberating. You are not your unconscious patterns. You are the awareness that can observe them. The part of you reading these words, understanding these concepts, recognizing yourself in these descriptions, that's your conscious mind. And it has power your unconscious lacks. It can choose, it can learn, it can grow. Your relationship sabotage isn't proof that you're broken beyond repair. It's evidence that you learned to survive in circumstances that required those defenses. But survival strategies appropriate for childhood become prisons in adulthood. Understanding your unconscious doesn't make you weak. It makes you free. This is Freud's enduring legacy. The darkness, once illuminated, loses its power to control you.